You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sebastian Duque Rios, and today we're diving into one of the biggest and fastest moving questions facing the energy system right now: how the rapid growth of data centers and artificial intelligence is reshaping electricity demand and whether load flexibility can help the grid keep up. To help us unpack that question, I'm joined by two guests who approach this issue from different but highly complementary perspectives. Aroon Vijaykar leads the commercial team at Emerald AI, where he works at the intersection of data centers, software, and the power grid. Aroon comes to this work after a career in energy and finance, including investing in utility-scale power infrastructure and several years at Sunrun, where he worked on how non-traditional energy assets like batteries and distributed resources can provide value to the grid. At Emerald, he's focused on scaling software-driven flexibility inside data centers themselves. I'm also joined by Dalia Patino-Echeverri, an associate professor at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Dalia has spent nearly 2 decades studying power systems, grid reliability, and decarbonization, and she leads the GRACE Lab at Duke, where her team works to contribute to the pursuit of environmental sustainability, affordability, reliability, and justice in the energy sector. After years focused on how to decarbonize the grid, her recent work has turned to a new challenge layered on top of that: how to accommodate large new loads like data centers without compromising reliability, affordability, or climate goals. Together, Aroon and Dalia will help us think through what data center load flexibility really looks like, technically, economically, and from a policy perspective, and why it's becoming such a critical piece of the energy conversation. Aroon, Dalia, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Sebastian. Thanks for having me, and good to see you, Dalia.
Good to see you, Aroon.
So I'd love to start with the general question of what are data centers and why are they so essential to the development of AI systems such as large language models?
Yeah, well, data centers are facilities that basically house servers and also the networking equipment and all the ancillary services equipment, the cooling systems to both store and process and send information. And they are necessary for AI because training and operating large language models requires very massive parallel computing and requires also all-time availability of data access and a lot of power, electricity, that is only available in these very large data centers.
Data centers are kind of central to the new economy, right? We're now increasingly in the business of manufacturing intelligence. That's kind of what AI is doing. And data centers are the linchpin, the factories that help us turn electricity into tokens, right? Take electricity as an input and manufacture intelligence as an output. And so that's the centrality of data centers to the new fast-growing AI economy.
Thank you both. And Dalia, I think you began touching on this a little bit, but to emphasize this, how are data centers then driving a growth and increasing demand on electricity and related infrastructure?
Yeah, data centers are highly energy intensive, and the individual facilities, even if small, demand a lot of power and energy capacity. So even a very small data center for a small research university, and this is really tiny compared to the hyperscale, we're talking like 2 megawatts, for example, of power capacity. To get this, you would need, if you were going to power it with rooftop solar, for example, you would need 1,200 homes with small systems of 4 kilowatts. So even at that scale, you begin to see the challenge. Now, even though data centers have become more and more energy efficient, the speed at which demand for the functions that they perform, for the services that they provide, is growing very fast. So whatever gains you see in energy efficiency are more than offset by this rapid adoption of AI in all its forms, and therefore more and more energy requirements.
I just flagged the unprecedented nature of this moment. Utilities are sort of used to having data center developer operators call them up for a new 10 megawatt facility or connection, not 1 gigawatt. And so it's a very new paradigm we're in, where utilities are experiencing unprecedented load growth. and unprecedented backlogs of interconnection queues that often the interconnection queue itself sort of rivals the existing load on the system for a given utility. That's exciting from one perspective for a utility to have this opportunity to tap into massive new load growth after 20 plus years of sort of flat load in the US. But the flip side of that is that it's an incredible challenge to serve this scale of new load. And I'll also flag like an interesting angle of that, which is a lot of the utilities we talk to, they say that the folks that were in their organizations, like literally the employees who are now there at utilities, have never worked there in an environment of load growth. They've been there during a period of stable load. The folks that experience load growth have retired, right? Or unfortunately passed on, right? Like that's kind of how long it's been in many cases since we've experienced meaningful load growth. So it's not only a technological challenge, but also an organizational challenge for utilities and load serving entities to meet this moment.
Yeah, so the electricity demand used to grow at 0.9% a year in the US, 0.9% a year. Now we are thinking that in the next few years, it's going to grow 4 or 5% a year. So you can see the magnitude of the challenge. And at the same time, we cannot build infrastructure at that pace.
And that's a really interesting perspective that I hadn't considered, just how long it's been since we've seen this kind of load growth, right? And I think you're both driving a point home of the existing infrastructure that we have at the moment is insufficient to meet these demands. And we either need to see new energy developments, or there needs to be some sort of other solution or innovation that helps to account for some of this demand. And so before we move on to some of those possible innovations, I wanted to ask what's driving some of the constraints and delays on data center projects and or energy projects.
So there are different pieces to the barriers that development of data centers are facing. First, even though we may have the capacity to generate more electricity than we have today, we don't have the capacity to guarantee that we can serve an increase in the peak of the electricity consumption. And for that, you need to install new power generation capacity and need to make sure that it is connected to a place in the grid that can access the demand center, the place where this electricity is going to be consumed. It turns out that transmission capacity is scarce. There is not a lot of room for integrating new loads or new generation, given just the lines that we have. And so you need to run a study and see what would happen if you install this new power generation capacity. Would it be possible to inject the electricity that is going to produce at all times, and especially when it is needed? And what kind of upgrades are needed in the system for guaranteeing that? Those studies take time, and then often they come back with conclusions about the cost of the upgrades needed being very high, which may delay or prevent some of that development. So that has been going on for a long time, even without anticipating this shift in the paradigm of load growth that data centers bring. And it's just there are different problems. For example, you build a new transmission line, there are the problems of siting. There is the NIMBY and the banana, like build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. The challenges of siting, like multiple jurisdictional entities. So lines take a long time to design and permit. Then also it's hard to decide how to allocate the costs of these lines, also because the studies that will determine who benefits from a new line are complex and may be delayed, and many times they are not authoritative because it depends a lot of what are your assumptions on future usage of these lines and future developments of the grid, which nobody knows what is going to happen. So we already have a tight system that has becoming tighter because we've been retiring or have plans to retire power generation capacity for the purpose of reducing air emissions. And that brings even more challenges to accommodating new load.
Yeah, I think that all really nails it. From my perspective, I think about a few different categories of this. So on the generation side, there's a bifurcation, and it's capacity and it's energy. Capacity is relating to, can we meet the peak? Energy is, can we supply enough megawatt hours? And, Dalia pointed out this distinction earlier, and how often there's less of an energy concern right now and more of a capacity concern right now. And that's projected to eventually change, or eventually a few years from now, we might start running into energy challenges as we build out more generating capacity. But then there's also downstream issues, right? You've got deliverability. Can power get there, whether that's through transmission and distribution? And then there's kind of interconnection and operations. There's real processes that need to be worked through around connecting new facilities, around the studies that Dalia referred to, and around operations. Can the new system operate the way you want it to once you've added new elements? So not to mention all the sort of siting and permitting issues. So you start with something simple, which is you think, hey, we just need to make more power to serve this load. But when you actually break it down, it breaks down into all these different buckets that need to be worked through, and each of which often have their own team at utilities looking at them.
And I also wanted to touch base on the concern that some people hold over how the scale of these resource demands might have an impact from an environmental, social, and economic standpoint.
I'm happy to take that first. I'll kind of pair it with a bit of an additional answer to what you said earlier, the question of whether existing infrastructure is sufficient. There's a bit of a yes and no answer. The no side of that is that, we've got to build additional generation, transmission, infrastructure to serve new load in many cases. Absolutely. No doubt about that. With that said, as you know, I lead the commercial team for Emerald AI, and at Emerald, we are focused on a load flexibility solution that helps us get more out of our existing infrastructure. And so that's the yes part of the answer, which is that in many cases, doing business as usual would mean going and building more, adding more, putting more steel in the ground. And that really runs the risk of causing issues like driving up rates for everyday energy ratepayers, right? Which is you and me. And there are a lot of opportunities for us to use flexibility, which is to have large data centers flex down their power utilization during times of real constraints on grids in a way that helps us actually shave that system peak. And that may be related to solving a generation issue. It could be related to solving a transmission issue. It could be related to solving an emergency kind of contingency failure on the system. There's a variety of use cases to say, when can we intelligently flex down our utilization, or what's traditionally called demand response, to mitigate some of the impacts on our system and use the system we already have better. Just as an example, I believe the stats are that in the last year, China added something like 350 gigawatts of additional capacity, while the US added something like 50. So they almost had like 7-8x of what we added in a year. What it tells us is to win the AI race, our winning strategy may not be going and building, because we're never going to be as fast as China at building new capacity. It's not to say that building is not a part of the solution, but that we should look at how the yes and the no of, is our existing infrastructure sufficient? There's a no, which is we got to build for sure in certain cases. And there's a yes, which is in certain situations, let's look at how flexibility can help us use the system we have better. And that kind of brings me to the question of, what are the social and environmental concerns of the path we're on right now? On the social side, I'd say we stand to have a social revolt on our hands if we do things the old way, which is, hey, there's load growth. We'll do things the old way, which is just go build to the peak, keep putting steel in the ground, and rate base all of that infrastructure, which rate base really is energy industry jargon for saying utilities incur that cost and then go charge ratepayer customers to make a return on that investment. And that's a formula for potentially just continuing to raise electricity rates. And that could lead to a social revolt on our hands. People would say, hey, AI is actually not great for us as a society, right? Look at what it's doing to my energy bills. It's driving up rates. So that's the social side of it. The environmental side of it, I think, is around emissions and how, if we can't find ways to connect data centers faster, data center developers are going to go build a bunch of this power infrastructure behind the meter. They're just going to build their own power on their own land rather than waiting for utility power to come. And more often than not, that behind the meter powered infrastructure tends to look more fossil fuel intensive. And then that's locking us into decades of more fossil-based generation rather than using the grid, which comes with often a cleaner mix of resources.
Yes, I agree that there are several concerns. I want to start by saying that we already had a problem when we looked at the pace at which we needed to build new infrastructure to electrify residential and commercial industrial uses of fossil fuels and the transportation sector, and then power all that electrification with carbon-free electricity. So if you think about it, we consume about 4,000 terawatt hours of electricity a year. So we need to decarbonize all of that. Then you put on top the use of fossil fuels for residential and commercial and industrial purposes. Then you have another, let's say, 7,000 terawatt hours. And then you put all the transportation sector, and that's another maybe 7 or 8,000 terawatt hours. So all of that, like thousands of terawatt hours a year, like the infrastructure to generate that reliably has to be built. And when you think that we build capacity to generate electricity, like these 4,000 terawatt hours that I mentioned earlier, the slope of that curve was 4 in 70, like maybe, so 4,000 terawatt hours every 70 years. And now we need to decarbonize and electrify, which means building like 20,000 terawatt hours capacity to generate that in 70 years. So that's 5 times faster than what we have done. And if you add other factors, you will come with the conclusion that between 3 and 13 times faster. What can you build fast today? You can build diesel generators. There are many reasons why building cleaner energy infrastructure takes a long time. I alluded to permitting issues. There are procurement issues, etc. Building diesel-fired generators, lots of small ones in a premise, is a fast thing to build. So the race to win the AI competition, this rush to win the AI competition, may bring terrible infrastructure online. And as Aroon said, may lock us into a pathway of high fossil fuel use. Now, even if we are able to move away from that daunting scenario and have renewable energy, at least for a portion of that, there is an environmental impact that is not negligible and needs to be considered. There is impact on communities, and there is impact on the cost of electricity, which, if not handled correctly, with new ways to allocate cost across different customers and new ways to form prices in competitive electricity markets, will affect consumers. So those are the concerns. Now, the other is a concern that comes from the question, what are the problems that the AI is solving that cannot be solved without putting all these resources that we are putting on the table? So like a little bit of skepticism from people who are losing jobs, like first college grads that are seeing entry-level jobs taken away, and proliferation of data centers in places that are urban places where people thought could live forever. Those are concerns that need to be addressed, and I think can be addressed if we all put our brains together and our modeling and analytic capacities for that goal.
Thank you both. And that's why we're here today, right? To think through these big questions and big ideas and how we can come up with a good governance structure and a future that'll benefit all of us and all of our communities. And so I want to move towards this idea that I think, Aroon, you alluded to, of load flexibility, and that Emerald AI is really working on implementing on the ground, and we'll get to that. But Dalia, recent work coming out of Duke suggested that we could add significant new load with only modest curtailment. Could you explain how this idea of curtailment-enabled headroom reframes grid limits through load flexibility, and why this concept is particularly relevant for data centers, especially in terms of the kind of load reductions or usage shifts that are realistically achievable?
Well, to understand what curtailment-enabled headroom means, it's useful to revisit the traditional approach that we have used in this industry, electricity industry, to address load growth and develop the capacity. So the approach consists of 2 steps. One, you forecast what is going to be your peak consumption and also your expected energy consumption from this new load and from the old loads as well. So like, what is the total new peak that your system has to face? And then you set up a system, a process to procure all the power generation and transmission capacity that is needed to meet this load reliably. It means building the electric power plants and expanding or building new power transmission capacity and all the transformers, etc., to serve that load and ensure that having a power outage because of the electricity demand exceeds the available supply is very rare. Now, how rare is acceptable? This is the standard for reliability. And the threshold that we pursue in the US is 1 day in 10 years of power outages. This means that if you take the 600,000 hours that you have in 10 years, the electricity supply should be more than enough to meet that demand most of the time, except for 24 hours, which is 1 day, right? So 1 day, it will not. And ensuring this high level of reliability, which is what we call having resource adequacy, so RA, people call it by the initials, resource adequacy, requires having something called the installed resource margin, or IRM. So what is the installed resource margin? It is how much electricity capacity the system has in excess of the expected peak load. For example, if the expected peak load for the next year is 170 gigawatts, and the system has a capacity of those 170 plus 17, so it would be 10%, right? Like, so 187 gigawatts total, then the installed resource margin is 10%, meaning at some point there could be an event that knocks down some of the supply or increases the demand, and things are suddenly more challenging, but the system still has 10% of room to accommodate that situation because there is 17% more capacity than what we are expecting as the worst case scenario, which is the peak. And the peak is not the peak we expect for the last year. The peak that we expect for last year considers the worst case we have seen in the last 10 years, adjusted by temperatures and new loads that we see in the system. Now, we've seen, like we saw in ERCOT in 2021, we saw it in North Carolina in 2022, that extreme weather conditions may result in increases in demand and decreases in supply simultaneously. So you may have power plants that don't run because of this extreme weather condition, and then residential customers demanding more electricity because it's extremely cold or extremely hot. So that is the traditional way in which you used to plan. Now, the consideration of headroom with load flexibility is a complete change of paradigm in terms of how the system addresses the prospect of load growth. So rather than thinking that any growth needs to be backed by electricity, capacity, and transmission, plus some reserve margin that, by the way, in my example, it was 10%, but it's usually 16%, because any of these pieces of load, maybe, for example, hospital, is no longer what we are thinking. So we are changing the way we address load growth. We assume that the new load that we are adding to the system doesn't need the same type of reliability of 1 day of outages in 10 years. It assumes that this load is flexible and it can disconnect from the system as needed to maintain the perfect balance between demand and supply that you need for keeping the lights on. So headroom is the difference between the capacity to serve the load of the system and the current load. And you find it by taking the difference for all hours of the year and then taking the minimum of it. Okay, when was the tightest gap between demand and supply? That's what I could use for accommodating a new load, provided that if my system needs it, they disconnect and nobody else has a shortage of electricity. So traditionally or often, this occurs in the summer for the summer peaking systems, which is most of the systems in the US. That is how we reshape how we think about grid limits. It is no longer asking for the grid to have all the capacity that you anticipate as a peak load plus a margin, but saying, I can count with the disconnection of this large load when the system needs it. Now, how much of a disconnection? It is up to us to decide what is an acceptable curtailment limit. The higher that curtailment limit, the more headroom you enable. The lower that curtailment limit, the more important you think that is not curtailing these loads or curtailing them very little in terms of the depth of the curtailment, like how much of their peak load are you going to curtail versus also the duration, for how long are you going to curtail it, then the lower the headroom. If you want zero headroom, then it's not that much what you can accommodate. If you're going to allow for these connections a few times a year, let's say no more than 50% of the peak load of that new load addition, and for less than a few hours, then you enable a lot of headroom.
Thank you, Dalia. That was an incredible explanation. I feel like I was in a classroom.
Yeah, thanks, Dalia. So I think you laid out really clearly how we have planned the grid build date and the promise of utilizing flexibility to rethink the paradigm. And so I think the natural question then is, why haven't we done this before? And why now? Why does this make sense now? And so I think really relevant for me to talk about that given our business model at Emerald AI. So maybe before I dive right into data center, just a little bit of history that we have done flexibility before. And it has a term and it's called demand response. And your listeners are probably familiar with it to some degree because maybe some of them have Tesla Powerwalls on their homes that are installed paired with a solar system that might be interacting with grids and reducing power utilization at times from the grid. More of your listeners probably have a thermostat, like a Nest thermostat, that they've probably gotten a push notification saying, hey, do you want to enroll in your utilities program? And your thermostat set points will be changed no more than, a couple of degrees every now and then when the grid is constrained. That's demand response. And it's been around for a long time, but unfortunately, it's probably not scaled as much as we would have loved for demand flexibility to scale. And it's certainly not relied on. And I think those are two different points, right? One is about just the scale and the utilization of it and customer uptake and utility utilization of demand response. But the other piece is, of course, how much are utilities counting on that resource to show up, that load reduction to show up when they call for it? And the answer to that is they haven't really relied on it in the past. And part of that relates to their relatively small assets. We're talking about small residential level load contribution or load reduction, right? Aggregating that across a ton of different homes is a little bit complex in both planning and operations. There's only kind of so much telemetry you can get from those facilities, from those homes. There's only so much you can rely on a homeowner not to say, no, I want to opt out of this event. The model just hasn't scaled especially well. It's important. I don't mean to sort of like diminish its importance, but I do want to contrast that with the opportunity in front of us with data centers. And I think there's a tremendous opportunities for data centers to sort of really meaningfully up-level the profile of demand response and demand flexibility in how we plan and operate grids. And there's a few reasons for that, right? One is that these are big. Any one of these data centers, or 1 gigawatt scale data center, I haven't done the math in my head about how many homes that sort of amounts to in terms of a traditional Nest thermostat aggregation, right? But suffice to say, it's the amount of headache you deal with to go sign up, the number of homes that it would take to comprise a 1 gigawatt facility is enormous. So there's a scale benefit here. There's the opportunity to have a load that is software defined. So contrast that with maybe a large factory that is more of an industrial factory, right? It's like a steel manufacturing facility, for example. These facilities, they're not entirely software defined and responsive within seconds to be able to curtail load or shape load, ramp down, ramp right back up. AI data centers can do these things because the majority of their load is from the IT compute, which is software defined and responsive on a millisecond scale, if not second scale. That also means there's opportunities to do more nuanced things like partial reductions, right? Flexibility as opposed to curtailment. It's not a binary on-off that a traditional factory might say, I can't turn off my facility, so I'm just not going to do this. A data center can actually provide a granular load shape that is not a full blunt curtailment from 0 to 1, right? It's a 5% load reduction, 10% load reduction, a specific ramp down over a specific defined period of time, so on and so forth. And then I think the other piece I'd flag is there's this major pain point for data centers around interconnection that creates a really nice incentive for them to be flexible. And specifically that is, there's an opportunity from a utility perspective to tell a data center, hey, if you, the data center, are willing to be flexible, I, the utility, can connect you much faster. It makes sense from the utility point of view because often the utility can't connect that data center because they're solving for some of those geeks that happen 1% of the year, and they need to go sink millions of dollars into infrastructure to solve for that really small number of hours of the year. And that takes many years, right? But with modest flexibility, if the utility can count on that flexibility from the data center, the utility can actually safely interconnect that facility on an accelerated timeframe. And the flip side is that's a huge incentive for a data center. Data centers are stuck in these massive interconnection queues, and it is a fantastic incentive for them if you tell them, yes, we can connect you much faster if you're willing to be modestly flexible. Look, data centers are here to do compute. They're not here to provide grid services, but you just got to think about the trade-off. And if you're the data center, being modestly flexible, call it, being willing to flex down your facility power usage by 5 to 25% for, call it 100 hours a year, which is like less than or about 1% of the year, is a good trade, right? For accelerating your time to revenue. And that's really what the AI companies care about right now is how fast can they energize these facilities that otherwise are languishing in interconnection queues, sometimes sitting with really expensive GPUs in the halls waiting to be energized. So these are all the reasons that there's a tremendous opportunity for AI data centers to be sort of the holy grail of demand response in a way that previous loads have not been.
It makes sense to think that a data center is not a hospital. Of course, there will be data centers that maybe are like hospitals in terms of the reliability they need and want to have. But it makes sense to think that some curtailment of the energy service can be tolerated without economic or human life losses. As Aroon said it, you could have that curtailment to be at a very large scale that is easier to handle by the system operator, which is not what you would have with residential neighborhoods or hospitals or some other commercial or industrial facilities.
And something I'm curious about is the big picture. If we scale out this flexibility, what does that look like? How much headroom does that free up in terms of new developments that could be brought on without increasing capacity?
Yes, for estimating how much headroom we have in different balancing authorities in the United States, we have first to decide what is an acceptable curtailment limit. We have been defining curtailment limit in terms of the proportion of energy that was going to be consumed in a year by this new large load that can be not served. So imagine if this large load was going to consume X megawatt hours in a year, then we're saying, well, we are okay with not serving 1% of that energy of that new load at some point. So that motivates us to think, okay, what is the meaning of a curtailment limit in terms of a percentage of energy not served during the year? What does it mean for the frequency of the curtailment events, for the depth of the curtailment events, and for the duration of these curtailment events? So I'm just going to give you an example. So in our report from February, the Rethinking Load Growth by the Nicholas Institute that you can find on the website, we have a first order estimate, almost like a back on the envelope calculation, taking what is an assumption about capacity in a system, what is the load, and then how much could you increase that load hour by hour before hitting or exceeding a curtailment limit. And we have numbers there. We have headroom estimates for 1% curtailment limit, 0.5%, and 0.25%. The question is, what does that curtailment limit mean? So for a 0.5% curtailment limit, there are many combinations of how many hours and how long, how much depth in the curtailment you would have for a 0.5% limit. So for example, you could say none of the load is served for 44 hours. That is a 0.5% curtailment limit, like 100% curtailment depth for 44 hours. Or you could say 50% of the new load not served for 88 hours, or maybe 20% of the new load not served for 219 hours. Is that acceptable? Maybe not. So then we have to choose what is the curtailment limit, and has to be considered at the same time as what are the investments and the designs of the data centers that are going to enable that curtailment. What needs to happen so that when the curtailment events happen, they are not disruptive, they don't cause economic losses or negative consequences. Once you choose that, then you need to look at what are we going to assume about the extant load, the load that is not coming from the data centers, but just the system load, and which weather years are we going to consider. So like for a first order estimate, if we looked at PJM and we said, let's use the weather of year 2023 and everything we know about how it affected demand and renewable energy production and outages and the ratings of conventional generators, then we would say there is almost 16 gigawatts of headroom. 2023 was a very mild year in terms of weather, so not a lot of outages caused by this weather. Demand was very normal production from renewables. If we take the weather of 2024, maybe it would be 6.5. So 60% less headroom if we use the year of 2024. So we can calculate those numbers. We need to choose the curtailment limit based on what is that is going to enable the flexibility of the data centers. And we also need to represent the system assets in the best and most realistic possible way so that we can anticipate what would happen if we are counting with this flexibility in years to come.
Thank you, Dalia, for that explanation. And I think you make it clear that there's a lot of factors involved, but there is potential to have significant headroom come out of flexibility. And so, as we mentioned earlier, one of the pathways to potentially meeting new demand would otherwise be through construction. But instead of relying solely on new build-out, flexibility offers us a different pathway. What are the broader system benefits of that approach, especially social and environmental benefits?
I think of secondary benefits in terms of three quick things, right? Because I think we've already talked about benefit. Number one, kind of trade-off, which is utilities get to serve load faster and data centers get to come online faster, right? It's the sort of principal baseline win-win of the trade that we're talking about with flexibility. But there's three kind of key ancillary benefits I'd highlight. Benefit number one is affordability for society. This is the opportunity to avoid overbuilding our infrastructure and therefore protect rates. And in fact, there's an opportunity to go in the opposite direction. And PG&E put out some numbers. PG&E is the large utility in Northern California. And they put out numbers suggesting that for every 1 gigawatt of additional data center capacity that comes online, there's a 1 to 2% potential for rate reductions. And the reason for that is that those data centers could come online and meaningfully use the system we have better. And that helps us spread the same megawatt hours that are being sold across the same fixed asset base, right? So that's one, affordability. That's huge. Benefit number 2 is around emissions. Not only does flexibility often get called when the grid is the dirtiest, right? So you can imagine like a hot summer evening and the utilities having to fire up all these peaker gas plants, and they call on data centers to flex down, and that helps them need to generate less dirty power from those peaker plants at those hours. So that's certainly the obvious opportunity, but there's a much bigger opportunity, I think, around avoiding data centers going and building their own power behind the meter that is going to be dirtier than the increasingly cleaner mix of resources that are available on well-scaled utility grids. And then I think the third point I'd make is around AI competitiveness, right? As a country, I think if we want to be competitive on AI, and China is the obvious competitor on this front, we're going to have to get these data centers connected faster. And the way we do that is not just going to be through building the system through more infrastructure and steel in the ground. It's going to be through using flexibility. So I think it's those 3 things, right? Affordability, emissions, and AI competitiveness, in addition to the sort of baseline transaction I mentioned earlier, which is the trade that utilities get a more reliable asset for their grids that is grid friendlier and that allows them to serve more load while getting faster time to power for these data center companies.
I think the benefits can come, as Aroon said, from improving the low duration curve. So the low duration curve is a metric of how much do we use each resource in a system. And because demand of electricity fluctuates so much every day, and like every hour of the day, every day of the week, and also every month of the year, then we have a lot of resources that are used only a few hours a year. When you look at how much of the capacity are you using in a year, then it's not much, because you need to have what you need for your peak, but your peak happens only a few hours a year, and the rest is just this big discrepancy between your average load and your peak load. So as Aroon says, utilizing more resource, an electricity generating unit, reduces the cost per unit of electricity generated by that unit. That's the levelized cost of electricity. So you increase what is called the capacity factor or the utilization factor of this resource. And that means every unit is now less expensive because the capital costs are spread over more hours of electricity generation, more electricity. So that is a good thing if you are the investor who built this power plant and you want to recover revenue from this plant. You're using it more, you pay the same capital cost, and now you sell more electricity. For that to translate into gains for ratepayers, there needs to be some care into that, like depending on where you are in a vertically integrated utility or in a market, in an organized wholesale electricity market. Because at the same time, we have to remember that the way we operate power systems is by scheduling and dispatching all the resources in a way that minimizes the cost of electricity generation. So that means the resources that are the least cost, those that produce electricity at the least cost, are scheduled and dispatched most often. And those that are more expensive are used only sparingly when we need them to meet the peak load. So if you say, okay, now I'm increasing the load, well, I'm going to be using more of the expensive resources, not more of the inexpensive resources. So the marginal cost, which is how much it costs to produce 1 more megawatt hour at every place on my grid, is going to increase. And right now, in organized electricity markets, we price electricity equal to this marginal cost. So if we don't change that way, the locational marginal prices will increase. Now, often, not always, but often, the cost of producing electricity correlates with the emissions per unit of electricity. So the dollar cost per megawatt hour of electricity generated usually corresponds with the tons of CO2 emitted per unit of electricity generated. It means that if we don't change the grid and we still have on the margin fossil fuels, we will still be dispatching more expensive, but also more emitting sources than before. the benefits that Aroon is alluding to will come with a simultaneous replacement of the grid with cleaner resources. Then we will have great economic incentives for overcapacity on renewables and storage, because now the utilization of them is kind of guaranteed because these data centers are going to be there and we don't have to overbuild because they are going to be flexible. So we don't need to have this extra room on top of the expected peak. So the benefits will be there, but I think they need to come hand in hand with some greening of the grid, if what we want to see is environmental benefits, and some reform on tariffs or rate structures, and also price formation in electricity markets.
Thank you, Dalia. That was very well put, and I think raised some really important equity considerations as we move forward to see how this innovation can be implemented via policy in some way that ensures benefits reach as many folks in as many communities as possible. And so, Aroon, I really want to turn the page over to the work that Emerald AI is doing on facilitating this idea of load flexibility. So, bringing this down to the operational level, what does load flexibility look like inside a data center environment? And how does Emerald AI function as a mediator between data centers and the grid?
Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we're working on at Emerald AI. At the outset, I want to flag the great work that a number of companies are doing in this realm. It's been really fun to see the whole energy community rally to the cause of meeting this moment where we've been hit by a number of years of a tough market environment around rising interest rates and a policy uncertainty at the federal level and even state level policy issues. But here we have this fantastic opportunity for the energy industry to come together and solve really a generational challenge of powering AI in a rapid, but also sustainable and clean and smart way. And within that, there's a whole cohort of companies doing really interesting work on flexibility. Our particular approach to flexibility at Emerald is heavily driven by the insight that we can actually orchestrate AI workloads to generate that power flexibility. So a lot of our peers in the industry are using more CapEx-based approaches, right? Hardware innovations to either generate power behind the meter or store power behind the meter, such that data centers can pay for and install those assets behind the meter to be flexible when the grid needs it. Our particular approach is actually entirely software driven, where our customers are data center operators and data center tenants, and they adopt our software solutions in order to do sort of the following: ingest signals from utilities when grids are constrained, coordinate a load response across the different assets they have on site. And when I say assets, I just mean sources of energy or uses of energy that can be orchestrated to deliver a load reduction at the site meter. That might be batteries on site. That might be some form of generation and diesel gensets on site to the extent permits are allowing them to be used. That may be using your cooling and throttling that to deliver some demand response from the cooling of the data center. And then, of course, our secret sauce around compute. So how do you take a signal from the grid and allocate that to these different flexibility resources on site that can all pitch in to collectively deliver that load reduction? And then the piece that is compute, we actually take that, and on the tenant side in the data center, we orchestrate AI workloads by being integrated with those underlying compute tenants. And what do I mean when I say orchestrate? Well, there's a variety of tactics we could use, right? Ranging from pausing and resuming certain jobs, scaling down and back up the number of GPUs assigned to jobs, power capping GPUs to slow their progress, geo-shifting workloads from one location to another, for example, a congested grid to a facility on a grid that's not congested. And so there's a variety of tactics we can employ. And there's also an intelligence we need to bring to how we deploy those tactics, right? Depending on the workload type in question, there are certain tactics that we use that may work better versus may work worse. And so it's about understanding, when you get that signal from the grid, what are the workloads running in this facility in this moment? What are their typology and therefore tolerance to certain tactics of orchestration? And also, how does the customer think about these workloads? What are their flexibility tolerance? What are the workloads that the customer doesn't want us touching versus have more flexibility in them? And so that's to give you a flavor of how we go about orchestrating those AI workloads in order to make sure we're meeting the SLAs with the underlying compute tenant for their computations that need to be done, while also meeting the load shape that we need to deliver in tandem with those hardware-based approaches, right? What contribution might we be getting from not only the compute, but also a battery on site or the cooling? So that's a little bit about how Emerald is approaching this. And it's been tremendous to see the traction globally. We have fantastic partners in the likes of NVIDIA on the compute side of things, or National Grid on the energy side of things, some great investors, some great early commercial partners that are all exploring how can we adopt this technology and then use it to get confidence around developing accelerated interconnection programs. So back to what we discussed around the opportunity to offer accelerated times to power in exchange for flexibility, how can Emerald be at the center of that, right? To say, if you can use a technology like this, the utility can say, yes, this is a grid-friendly data center that will be reliably flexible when I need it to be within certain parameters, obviously, that protect the data center from not being overused as a source of flexibility, because obviously they're here to do compute, not just provide grid services.
Fantastic. And I think our listeners would be really interested to hear a little bit about how feasible this technology is today. I know there's been some pilots and early deployments if you wanted to share some insights from that.
Yeah, happy to. So we sort of started off with a demonstration in May of 2025 in an Arizona data center, an Oracle facility with NVIDIA GPUs and running on Databricks kind of workloads, or running Databricks workloads, and went to the utilities in Arizona, SRP and APS, and said, hey, what would you need to see as a demand response event, like a demonstration of responsiveness to a grid signal that would help you, the utility, get some comfort that you can accelerate the interconnection of this facility because you can avoid certain expensive and time-consuming grid upgrades that you would have had to make for an inflexible data center. And they gave us a set of parameters, and that was, hey, we want to see you ramp down your facility load gradually over a 15-minute period by 25%, hold that 25% load reduction over a 3-hour period, and then gracefully ramp back up over a 10-minute period. Avoid snapback, which is to say, avoid overshooting when you come back up to the original load level. And so as you can tell from these specifications, it's not just a simple, can you reduce the power utilization? It's got some very specific parameters so that the utility is not only worried about load reduction, but also, hey, don't suddenly drop off, which can be bad for the system, or suddenly jump back up, or overshoot. There's other considerations as well. And we did that experiment successfully while also demonstrating that for Databricks' workloads, we were able to not only meet, but far exceed the thresholds they set for every flexibility category of workloads. So we had Flex 1, Flex 2, Flex 3 type jobs. And your Flex 3 jobs were your much more flexible jobs that we could eat into more, right? But also do that in intelligent ways that gets us more bang for our buck, right? Seeking opportunities to get greater load reduction with minimal compute impact. Whereas on the Flex 1 jobs, we essentially didn't touch them because they were relatively inflexible and we didn't need to. We were able to get the juice we needed from more flexible workload types. From that successful first demonstration, which we announced in July alongside our seed round announcement, we've gone on to do an additional demonstration in Chicago that showed how we could take that earlier R&D demonstration and turn it into a much more commercial ready deployment where we advanced the realism on a variety of fronts. So had sort of workloads hitting us that we'd never seen before, not knowing when they were going to hit us, having a realistic environment of workloads entering, being processed, and exiting, and getting those new workloads during the course of the experiment. So really mimicking more a real-world data center and being integrated with some of the commercial scheduler software layers like Kubernetes and Slurm that AI compute companies use. So in a variety of ways, we just advanced the realism in that second deployment compared to the first deployment. And, can't say much more, right? But as we speak, there's ongoing deployments that continue to push the boundaries here. And then I guess what I'll end with here is a really exciting announcement was just a month or so ago, we announced along with NVIDIA that we were a part of their reference architecture for AI factories. So NVIDIA is really pushing this all forward for the industry and defining this new data center type, which is an AI factory, which they really see as the building blocks of the AI economy. Obviously, NVIDIA's core interest is in monetizing more and more GPUs, but given their size and influence, they're really helping move the whole industry forward. And so they're building a lot of the software that sits on top of that hardware and defining the whole reference architecture across both software and hardware for how their partners should go and build these data centers. And a part of that reference architecture is flexibility as an inbuilt capability. So that's really exciting because we were sort of named as their power flexibility partner in that reference architecture, along with a handful of other companies that they're partnered with on different parts of the overall AI factory stack. So a really exciting announcement that Jensen Huang made at NVIDIA's GTC conference in DC not too long ago. And so as a part of that, they're building the first AI factory in Manassas, Virginia, that's already broken ground and will go live in Q3 of 2026. So really exciting that we'll be a part of that deployment, and that will really show the world not just a demonstration deployment, but an actual commercial, real-life operating deployment to show how an AI factory can be flexible by nature. And I think that'll really catalyze the whole industry to feel like, hey, this is really past R&D. This is here and now, and it's how the industry is going to operate going forward.
Well, Aroon, congratulations to both you and Emerald AI on that announcement. It's really exciting to see some forward progress on deploying this technology, and I'm really interested to see how nitty-gritty the specifications of flexibility that we were discussing earlier can get.
Yeah, one thing to point out is some data centers, like cloud serving data centers, need a lot of reliability. They often talk about the 5 nines of reliability, which means you could interpret it in terms of hours served. So that's 99.999% of the hours served. That means the tolerance for complete loss of power, like a very deep curtailment event, is not more than 5 minutes. So you'll need very advanced technologies to make sure that they get the reliability they need. That if they were going to be flexible, perhaps those are not our first targets for flexibility, but if they were going to be flexible, they can, in 5 minutes, shift loads temporally, geographically, or turn on their backup resources so that they spend less than 5 minutes offline in a year.
Absolutely. And, load flexibility, as well as specifically compute load flexibility of the type that we're talking about, is certainly not a silver bullet, right? It presents a massive opportunity, both in terms of the way we can do business, right, and the way we can energize more of these facilities. But there are very real trade-offs, and certain data centers will sort of decide that they don't have a tolerance for having any form of flexibility and are happy to wait through longer interconnection queues or pay more to utilities to get that sort of entirely uninterrupted power. But it's also worth calling out that outside of just the interconnection benefits, there are other benefits that flexibility opens up for data centers. They get the opportunity in many cases to manage energy costs better and not only reduce energy bills, but actually monetize flexibility. So get revenue from grids for being flexible. There's also tremendous opportunities that we've found in our business development work with a lot of data centers around just better planning behind the meter around some of their infrastructure, both in terms of the infrastructure they would build and then the power they can use. So on the infrastructure they can build side, it's, hey, how can you avoid overbuilding a massive battery or overbuilding diesel genset backup infrastructure that's fully redundant and mitigate some of that and lean on a combination of some of those things and compute flexibility as well. Not only for cost reasons, but also supply chain reasons, right? The diesel genset and UPS supply chain is often really painful. And a lot of developers struggle with that and sort of say, wow, if I could actually kind of complement that with compute flexibility, it'll really help me mitigate some of that infrastructure build out. On the power utilization side, a lot of companies fight tooth and nail to go get power allocations from utilities, only to then see their facilities' power budget underutilized, right? So like a data center will be persistently running at 50% utilization or 60% utilization, and that's leaving a lot of power on the table. And so power flexibility can be an opportunity also for some of these data center operators to theoretically over provision the power, to sort of say that, look, this power is perennially underutilized. I can actually, if I have the floor space, bring in some more racks of servers and over provision the power recognizing that then I'm going to fly a little closer to the sun at times, but I can use compute flexibility to ensure that at any given time, my overall facility stays within its required power limits and its thermal design point. So there's a variety of ways flexibility can be used to bring value to the data center that go beyond just the simplistic faster time to power. And it's been cool for us to go out to the market and pitch the faster time to power and often hear back, hey, that's great, and we want to work on that. But we've also got these other problems that we think your technology can help us with.
It's really awesome, really interesting. And I just wanted to ask about practical policy tools that could help incentivize this or accelerate the deployment of load flexible technologies at the local, state, or even national level.
Well, as we have said, the traditional way to ensure resource adequacy, to allocate costs, and to procure capacity in markets may not work the best given the challenges posed by the very fast growth of these loads. So we need to consider several approaches, and there will be some more appropriate for different applications, locations, and resource mix, etc. But all needs to be on the table. And one of those resources needs to be flexibility and the design of new contracts where those willing to provide flexibility to the grid receive the deal that enables that flexibility.
I think Dalia hit the nail on the head, right? There's just a lot of opportunities for utilities to do things in a new way. And I totally respect the challenge they're up against, which is that it is a bit of a new paradigm. It does require them to innovate on technology, but also on process. I mean, for example, with flexible interconnection, what we're really asking utilities to do is bring what they typically call demand side management, which is the teams that manage demand flexibility, and transmission planning and interconnections teams, and kind of connect them together, bring them together and institute a new business process that makes them reliant on each other. That's a new way of working. And utilities, understandably, are very cautious about doing things in a new way because it's often catastrophic when they get things wrong. It's incredible when you talk with utilities. You can see how the sort of scars of events from many years past are still really felt because that's how meaningful they are. I think in the traditional private sector, we kind of move from issue to crisis faster and forget things faster. But those crises have life and death implications often for utilities. And so they're understandably cautious. But we're excited to be working with a bunch of utilities on exploring exactly how they can set up new approaches, from how to study a flexible load in a new way to how to operationalize that in terms of both setting up interconnection agreements that require flexibility as a condition for a certain form of interconnection benefits, to ultimately what is that technical integration between the data center and the operating room at the utility side to dispatch that flexibility when it's needed. So there's a bunch that utilities need to work through. And there's a lot of activity happening at the Public Utility Commission level, which is how states typically regulate their utilities, is through their Public Utilities Commission. And so lots of dockets in the works that are advancing the sort of potential flexible future for data centers, as well as at the federal level. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, recently issued essentially a call for comments on how they can play a role in helping advance flexible interconnections to speed this up, because they see it as a national security issue as well, around how we can be competitive on the AI frontier. So there's a tremendous amount happening at the policy level that is gradually, one at a time, kind of landing, right, and getting operationalized by utilities.
Absolutely, Aroon. And to help make this more concrete for our listeners, we are starting to see some action at the state and utility level as well, though it looks very different depending on where you are. Texas is probably the clearest example so far. In 2025, the legislature passed SB 6, which directly brings very large new loads, including data centers, into grid reliability planning. So for new interconnections above a certain size, the new law requires things like the ability to curtail load or switch to on-site generation during emergencies in the grid. In other words, in Texas, flexibility is increasingly being treated as a condition of interconnection. Virginia, which is one of the biggest data center hubs in the world, has taken an alternative approach. The state has been spending a lot of time digging into data center growth and the possibility for flexibility, opening dockets, holding technical conferences, but they've stopped short of requiring curtailment. Instead, they've leaned more on rate design and long-term contracts to manage the risk and the costs. So the conversation is there, but the policy tools and implementation are different. And then there's everything happening alongside state policy. You've got companies like Google signing agreements with utilities to temporarily dial back data center load when the grid is under stress. And some utilities themselves are experimenting. PG&E's Flex Connect pilot is a good example, where customers can get connected faster if they're willing to be curtailed at certain times. So you're starting to see a mix of approaches, mandates in some places, pilots and contracts in others, and together they do point toward a future where data centers aren't just treated as fixed demand, but as something that through its flexibility can actually help keep the system running.
Something more is a lot of the questions we have about how to integrate data centers, how to tap into the flexibility resources, how to enhance reliability of a network, how to advance our goals of electrification and decarbonization of our electricity grid are not necessarily technical questions. They hinge on what does the law say and what is that we perceive as a just outcome that needs to be pursued. So I would encourage anyone listening to think about ways in which their own thinking and scholarly or practitioner expertise can contribute to these big questions.
Thank you both very much for joining me today. This has been a deeply insightful conversation, and it's a really interesting and innovative solution to continue thinking about as the whole world continues to develop this new technology.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyable to do this. Thanks, Sebastian, for the really insightful questions. I hope that your listeners feel that even if their work in their day job is not directly related to the work that Dalia and I are engaged in around the grid and our flexibility, that they find this topic relatable because it is relevant to all of our lives in some way, shape, or form, whether we are users of AI or users of power grids, which I think is all of us.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's been a pleasure. And Aroon, thank you. I learned a lot from you today.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.